Welcome back! Today we are looking at Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, which is one of his early comedies that explores the idea of identity. And so, as we're talking about identity, I thought I would invite a special guest to help us out here. You can go ahead and go. I can take it from here. So, Comedy of Errors explores the idea of identity. Who am I? Especially when everything I've ever known about myself suddenly gets called into question. It's one of his early comedies, and also one of the shortest of his comedies. And for a long time, people kind of dismissed it as being just plain farce. A farce is a style of comedy that is very slapstick, very physical, and very quick. And certainly Shakespeare is playing with the farcical style. However, he's adding a lot of layers to it that make it much more complex than it appears at first glance. So the basic premise is that there are two brothers who are twins, identical twins, and they're separated very, very early on. It's a long story, we'll get to that in just a minute. There are also a set of twin brothers who are servants to the twin brothers. And after being separated for over 30 years, the two finally come back together. But they come back together in a very comic way. One master and servant of the pairs comes into town and everyone recognizes him, everyone knows him. He starts walking around and doing things, and the other brother gets blamed for everything that he does. Shakespeare's pulling from an old Roman play, which has very similar features. A pair of twins who both show up in the same city and a lot of chaos ensues. So if Shakespeare's just copying another story, how is this more complex? There are two big things that Shakespeare does to add richness and complexity to this text. Number one, he layers different styles and source materials. So not only does he use this basic plot of twin brothers who don't know about each other and wander into the same world, but he also doubles the damage by adding twin servants, definitely amplifying the confusion. And on top of this, he overlays a romantic story about a man named Aegeon, who is tragically separated from his wife and then searches the world for her, stumbling into a town where he is condemned to death because of his nationality. Aegeon's story is partially heartbreaking and partially comic, and adds a layer of complexity and depth to the overall story. Shakespeare's original source material about the twins is straight farce. There is nothing deep or rich about any of the characters, or any of the themes. It laughs at human folly, it laughs at the idea of marriage, and Shakespeare also is interested in the idea of marriage, but he definitely takes it in a more complex way. Whereas the original Roman farce mocked the shrewish wife and at the end put her up for sale, this story explores what makes a marriage. And yes, it does talk about wives who get onto their husbands too much, but it also talks about what makes a good relationship between a husband and wife. And it's funny that Shakespeare takes the original story, which was between two cities, Syracuse and Epidendum, and he shifts it to Ephesus. We still reference Epidendum several times, but we move the setting to Ephesus. Why Ephesus? We also have a lot of reference to Corinth as a city where some of the family was taken away. Ephesus and Corinth are, of course, Roman cities, but they're also cities to which St. Paul wrote letters. And in those letters, he talks about the role of marriage. This becomes much more clear when we have a couple of characters who talk a lot about the ideas of marriage, and they use the same sort of terms that one would find in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, it says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." There is that idea of submission, and Luciana, one of the characters here, really emphasizes the idea that wives need to submit to their husbands. But Adriana, who is her sister and the wife of Antipholus, one of the twins of Ephesus, says that she doesn't fully understand marriage because she's not married. Adriana is very angry at her husband because of all the inconsistencies he's showing, especially now that he keeps showing up and being a different person each time. Immediately following in Ephesus, though, it gives some advice to husbands. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. And a little bit farther down it says, so ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. So, the husbands are supposed to love their wives as themselves. That idea gets definitely called into very comic question. How do you love your wife as yourself when you are losing your own identity? You don't even know who you are anymore. The more and more people get confused over the twins within this, the more confused the twins get, and the more difficulty they find in identifying who they are. Adriana says to Antipholus of Syracuse, who she confuses for her husband, how comes it now, my husband? Oh, how comes it that thou art then estranged from thyself? Thyself, I call it, being strange to me, that undividable, incorporate, and better than thy dear self's better part. I do not tear away thyself from me, for know, my love, as easy mayst thou fall a drop of water in the breaking gulf, and take unmingled thence that drop again, without addition or diminishing, as take from me thyself, and not me too. You can't separate the two of us. When you take yourself away from me, you're taking me away from myself as well. It's complicated. And yet, Antipholus of Syracuse has never seen this woman before in his life. Dromio of Syracuse, the other twin, meets the woman who says she is his wife. And in Act 3, Scene 2, he says, do you know me, sir? Am I Dromio? Am I your man? Am I myself? He discovers that this rather large woman claims him as her husband. And both sets of twins become more and more confused as the play goes on, to the point that they have lost their grip on themselves. So let's look at the plot. The play opens in Act 1 with Aegeon being condemned to death by the Duke of Ephesus because he wandered into town. Anyone from Syracuse who comes into Ephesus must be killed unless he pays 1,000 marks. And Aegeon tells his story, how he had a wife and the two of them were so in love, and he went off on a business trip that lasted a long time because of his business ventures not going very well. Eventually, she, missing him, came to find him, and she was pregnant, and she had her children in this trip. It was a set of twins, and at the same time, there was a poor woman who had a set of twins, and so because the woman was impoverished, Aegeon and his wife Emilia took on her twins and raised them up to be servants of his twins. However, on their return journey, their ship was wrecked, and the two parts of the ship split in half, and he was holding one of his twins and one of the servant twins, all strapped to a mast, while she was holding the other two. And at that moment, two ships from different cities came up and picked them up and carried them off in different directions. And so he lost his wife and one of his sons and one of his son's servants. In his grief, he named the child that he still had after its brother, Antipholus. But as they grew older, he wanted to find his wife, and so he set to searching for her. And he's searched high and low in all these different cities and never been able to find her. And now he's wandered into the city of enemies of his own people, who now demand that he give his life because he wandered into town, unless he can find 1,000 marks. But the Duke, because the story is so moving, says, well, I'll give you 24 hours to come up with the money, which doesn't do him much good because he doesn't know anyone in this place. Act 1 continues as Antipholus of Syracuse comes into Ephesus, disguising the city of his origin so he doesn't get caught for all this. And he and Dromio enter town. He gives his servant Dromio his money and says, go to the Centaur and get us lodging and then set up everything for us and then come get me here. And he stops and reflects for a moment on the loss of his brother since his childhood, how he wishes he could find his brother. But the idea of finding his brother is like finding another drop in an ocean. He says, I to the world am like a drop of water, that in the ocean seeks another drop, who falling there to find his fellow forth, unseen, inquisitive, confounds himself. So I, to find a mother and a brother in quest of them, unhappy, lose myself. Not only is he lost in the world looking for his mother and his brother, but there's the idea of losing myself. I've lost who I am because the other part of me is missing. Notice that's the same language that Adriana is going to use later on to talk about a husband and wife. The missing other part of me. But at this moment, Dromio of Ephesus, the twin of his servant, comes in, thinking Antipholus of Syracuse, his master, Antipholus of Ephesus. He says, come on home, it's time for you to come home to dinner. And Antipholus is completely confused. And he says, well, where's our money? Didn't you take it to the centaur like I asked you to? And Dromio of Ephesus is completely confused, not knowing what's going on. Finally, Antipholus gets angry and beats Dromio, and Dromio runs on home. And thus begins all of our conflicts. Act 2 begins with Adriana getting the message from Dromio of Ephesus and saying, okay, well, why did my husband not come home? She begins to get jealous and suspect her husband of things since he's not eager to come home when she sends the servant to call him. She sends Dromio back out to find him again. And her and Luciana argue about the nature of love and marriage. Luciana emphasizing the idea of service to one's husband. Whereas Adriana says that my husband and I are one flesh, and he ought to love me as himself. Antipholus is still angry that Dromio couldn't tell him where the money was. And then his own Dromio comes up, and Antipholus accuses him of taking the money. But Dromio's like, no, I just put it in the centaur like you asked me to. And Antipholus, thinking that Dromio is joking with him, and his servant also denies having just spoken to him. Antipholus is getting more and more angry, thinking that Dromio is just messing with him, when all of a sudden Adriana and Luciana show up and say, aren't you coming home to dinner? It's time to come home, husband. And Antipholus and Dromio are dumbfounded. But in their sort of stupor, they decide to follow the women home. Antipholus says, am I in earth, in heaven, or in hell, sleeping or waking, mad or well-advised, known unto these, and to myself disguised? I'll say as they say, and persever so, and in this mist at all adventures go. I guess we'll just go along with it. And yet he's beginning to doubt himself. Who even am I anymore? They put Dromio at the gate and tell him to not let anyone come in, which is definitely going to be problematic when, as Act 3 begins, home comes Antipholus of Ephesus, who's been out later than he expected because he was getting this gold chain for his wife. Of course, here's Dromio of Ephesus, who's like, why didn't you come home the first time? Why did you beat me? And Antipholus is very confused and a little bit annoyed at Dromio. But he and the goldsmith, who is going to make the chain for him, and his other merchant friends all come home. He invites them all to dinner. But when he gets to the door and starts knocking, Dromio of Syracuse won't let him in. He's been given this job to not let anyone in, including, apparently, the master of the house. Of course, Dromio stays on one side of the door, and they stay on the other side of the door so they don't see each other. But Dromio is talking to Dromio, and they're getting more and more angry because Dromio of Ephesus sees that someone has taken his name, someone has taken his position, and now he's been told that the master's already in the house, and they're driven away. Antipholus is enraged that his wife would invite someone over and then slam the door in his face. And so he decides to go eat a dinner at the Phoenix. Since his wife always assumes that he goes out and hangs out with other women, he's gonna hang out with this courtesan. Meanwhile, dinner's not going that well, especially since Antipholus is not really Adriana's husband. In fact, unfortunately, he's fallen in love with Adriana's sister, Luciana. And he tries to pull her over the side and tell her his love for her, and she says, no way, you're my sister's husband. Terrible idea. You should have faithfulness to my sister. And Antipholus is like, I have no reason to be faithful to her. I have never seen her before today. Meanwhile, Dromio's having his own problems, as the kitchen scullion, who he describes saying, she is spherical, like a globe, I could find out countries in her, has claimed him as her husband. Antipholus and Dromio finally are fed up with all this. This place is crazy. This is full of witches and magic or something. And so Antipholus sends Dromio to go get a ship. We gotta get out of this place. But all of a sudden, here enters Angelo, the goldsmith who is making the chain for Antipholus of Ephesus. And seeing Antipholus of Syracuse says, here's the chain I promised to make you. And Antipholus is like, oh, okay, cool. What do I owe you? And Angelo said, I'll collect later. Dah! And Antipholus is like, wow, people just hand me good gifts around here. Act 4. A merchant claims that Angelo owes him a big debt, and he's brought an officer to collect on Angelo. And Angelo says, no problem. I actually just made this gold chain for Antipholus, and so he owes me a price, which is the same as the price, nearly, that I owe you. So we'll just go over to Antipholus' house, and we'll collect from him, and I'll hand the money over to you, and all will be square. But when Antipholus of Ephesus and his servant Dromio arrive from their dinner with the courtesan at the Phoenix, Angelo says, hey, would you mind paying me for the chain? And Antipholus says, sure, I don't mind paying you for the chain. I don't have money right now. Just go to my house and ask my wife for the money. Just give her the chain. Angelo says, well, I already gave you the chain. Can you give me back the chain so that I can give it to your wife? Antipholus says, you didn't give me the chain. What are you talking about? And so Angelo has Antipholus arrested instead. Meanwhile, his servant Dromio has wandered off to get a rope to whip his household back into shape. And the other Dromio, Dromio of Syracuse, wanders in and says, hey, I got our ship ready. Ephesian Antipholus says, I don't need a ship, what are you talking about? I need money from home. Quick, go get some money for me so that they'll let me free. And Dromio goes, okay. He doesn't want to go back to the house because everything that happened there last time, but now he has to get the money. He shows up at the house and says, Antipholus has been arrested. And Adriana and Luciana are like, oh no, here, take the money. Even though Antipholus was apparently asking Luciana to cheat with him. They are very confused, and Adriana is more and more upset with her husband. Meanwhile, Antipholus of Syracuse is waiting for Dromio to show up and tell him about the boat. And Dromio does show up, with a big bag of money. Antipholus says, there's not a man I meet but doth salute me as if I were their well-acquainted friend, and every one doth call me by my name. Some tender money to me, some invite me, some other give me thanks for kindnesses. Some offer me commodities to buy. Even now a tailor called me in his shop and showed me silks that he had bought for me, and therewithal took measure of my body. Sure, these are much imaginary wiles, and Lapland sorcerers inhabit here. This is a place of magic. In rushes Dromio and says, here's the money. I'm gonna save you from being arrested. And Antipholus says, what are you talking about? And they decide to get out of there really fast, but the courtesan shows up and says, where's the diamond you took from me? Are you gonna give me that gold chain you promised? And Antipholus and Dromio are like, stay away! And seeing that Antipholus is going crazy, the courtesan's like, I've gotta go to his wife and just say that in his crazy fit, he stole my diamond. Meanwhile, Antipholus of Ephesus, who's still under arrest, sees his servant Dromio, who comes up with the rope. And he says, where's the money I sent you for? And Dromio says, you didn't send me for money, you sent me for rope. And at this moment, Adriana and Luciana come in with Pinch, a doctor who is going to cure her husband of his madness. Antipholus and Dromio argue with everybody because nobody's story seems to make any sense. Every story tells a different tale. And sometimes their details match up, and sometimes they don't. And Antipholus is really beginning to go crazy. And so they bind him and take him away. And the officer makes the claim of Angelo that Antipholus never paid for the gold chain. And then they're beginning to realize that sometimes they see with Antipholus with a gold chain, and sometimes they don't. Then in runs Antipholus and Dromio of Syracuse with their swords drawn, thinking that everyone around them are witches. And they say, oh no, Antipholus got free, and now he's really crazy. And they all run away. Act 5. Angelo and the merchant are both bummed because their business deals have really gotten messed up today. When in run Antipholus of Syracuse and Dromio. And he's got the gold chain. And Angelo's like, how dare you say you didn't have the gold chain when clearly you have the gold chain? And Antipholus says, I never said I didn't have the gold chain. In rushes Adriana, Luciana, the courtesan, and all the others. And they try to arrest Antipholus, but he runs into a priory. And the abbess upstairs says, she won't let anyone else in. After all, maybe Adriana drove him to madness by her scolding all the time. And since the abbess won't let Adriana in to see her husband, but has barred the door against them, Adriana decides to plead for help from the Duke, who just happens to be walking this way to execute Aegeon from Act 1, Scene 1. And Adriana pleads her case to the Duke, saying, please, my husband is gone crazy, and Aegeon remembers all the services that Antipholus had done for him, and so he wants to help. But just about that point, Antipholus of Ephesus breaks into the scene. And they're like, wait, I thought you were in the abbey. But here he is. And Antipholus tries to plead to the Duke, saying, my wife is driving me crazy. She's gone nuts. And again, they start comparing stories, but none of them make sense. All of a sudden, Aegeon says, wait, that's my son. He can vouch for me. He can help pay my bills. And Antipholus goes, I've never seen you before. Meanwhile, enters the abbess with the other Antipholus and Dromio. And suddenly, as everyone looks back and forth between the two of them, everything becomes clear. Adriana says, I see two husbands, or mine eyes deceive me. And the abbess is the one who's finally able to explain it all. The abbess says about Aegeon, whoever bound him, I will loose his bonds and gain a husband by his liberty. Speak, old Aegeon, if thou be'st the man that hadst a wife once called Amelia, that bore thee at a burden 2 fair sons. Oh, if thou be'st the same Aegeon, speak, and speak unto the same Amelia. And the abbess says that after they separated, her son and Dromio were taken from her by people of Corinth. And so she had to settle and be an abbess, all alone, by herself. And as the abbess describes the moment, she discusses the idea of having been in labor for her children for all of these years and finally giving birth to them. Here they finally are. 33 years have I gone in travail of you, my sons, and till this present hour my heavy burden ne'er delivered. The Duke, my husband, and my children both, and you the calendars of their nativity, go to a gossip's feast, and go with me after so long grief, such nativity. We finally have brought forth a family. The husband, the wife, the sons are all reunited, and the brothers are reunited. And having found each other, they've also found themselves. And all is resolved. What's to be gained from this? Is there a lesson here? Other than don't name both your twins the same name? Because all the confusion about marriage, all the confusion about the self isn't ultimately answered. The questions are posed. Who am I? What makes myself myself? And what is the relationship of marriage? All those questions are posed, but never really answered other than to tie the string and pull it all together. In any case, it is a laugh out loud funny play. And if it doesn't answer the question, at least it asks us to try to know who we are so that we can better enjoy our relationships and our marriages. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe or watch another video, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.